It's time now for Mark Meets, in which I speak to the biggest names in the world of politics, sport, showbiz and beyond, or those that simply have a big story to tell. Tonight, what are the true origins of coronavirus? A year ago, speculating that it might have been from a lab in Wuhan would have got you cancelled. Now it's being seriously considered by the authorities. But what is the truth about the source of this pandemic, one which has devastated the world? Well, I'm delighted to welcome Matt Ridley, a journalist and entrepreneur, and the co-author of Viral, the search for the origin of COVID-19. Well, it's brilliant to have you on the show. Matt Ridley, welcome to GB News.
Thank you very much. Good evening to you.
Congratulations on the publication of the book. It's winning rave reviews. It has become a pandemic must-read. Why did you write it?
Well, I co-wrote it with Alina Chan, a brilliant young scientist at Harvard, and we had both become increasingly intrigued by the failure to find the origin of this pandemic. Normally, we can find these things pretty quickly. In the case of SARS, it was a couple of months, and we'd worked out how people were getting infected. In this case, everything that we expected turned out to be a red herring, the pangolins, the market, all that kind of thing. And the more we looked into it, the more suspicious it became that the pandemic had begun in a city with a laboratory that is the leading laboratory in the world for studying these kinds of SARS-like coronaviruses. And that turned out not to be an idle speculation, because we then found all sorts of information that had been covered up that we had to dig out. We ended up writing a whodunit. I mean, it's very much a detective story. We don't conclude that it definitely came out of the lab. We can't rule out the possibility of a natural event, but we do think that it is now quite likely that that's what happened. And we take the reader as far as we can into every alleyway in this mystery to try and give them a taste of what the arguments are, what the evidence is, who's hiding what, who's got most to lose, etc., etc.
Now, what exactly does this laboratory in Wuhan exist to do?
Yeah, well, it's China's leading virology lab, and it has a team in there led by Shi Zhengli, who was originally tasked with tracking down the origin of SARS when SARS broke out 15 years ago. And she achieved that and found that horseshoe bats were the source, the ultimate source, the reservoir of this virus, and that all SARS-like viruses live in these horseshoe bats. So she then set about doing a program which was funded partly by the Chinese government, but partly by the American government, to go out into bat caves all over southern China and Southeast Asia, collect bats, get the viruses out of them, take them back to the lab, examine them, study them, sequence their genomes, then alter their genomes so as to test how dangerous they are in human cells and in mice carrying human genes. So they did a whole series of experiments, culminating in 2018 in an experiment in which they made a hybrid virus out of two of the viruses they'd collected in one of these caves, and found that it was 10,000 times more infectious than either of its parents in humanized mice. So these are significantly risky experiments. They're done with the best intention, that is to predict and prevent the next pandemic. But that didn't work, did it? I mean, they didn't predict or prevent this one, and it's not at all impossible that they may have contributed to causing it.
And there are laboratories of this nature all around the world, so its very existence isn't necessarily a cause for concern. How sloppy are the standards?
Yeah, you say that, but,
Go on, Matt.
Actually, in terms of SARS-like viruses, there are very few other laboratories in the world working on this. And this is the one with the biggest collection of SARS-like viruses and the biggest track record of publishing experiments on them in the world, not just in China.
And how high are the standards in these Chinese laboratories? I mean, is there a concern about sort of sloppy procedures which might have caused this particular virus to escape? Is there any case to answer in terms of the fitness of these laboratories for public health?
Well, there's two things to say there. One is that, on the whole, Chinese laboratories and Chinese science is run to a very high standard. There's a lot of safety procedures, etc. It's as good as most places in the world. But on the other hand, they were doing some of these experiments at biosecurity level 2, which is basically wearing a mask and gloves. That's about it, all you have to do. And because they thought they were working on bat viruses, which probably couldn't infect people, they thought that was safe. And the guidelines, the international guidelines don't really exist, but the national guidelines didn't say otherwise. So that is something that will have to be revisited in a hurry now after this. And the other thing to say is that there were concerns about this particular laboratory, because in 2018, a team from the US Embassy in Beijing visited it after they published some results, because they wanted help to improve their standards from an American university. And the team from the US Embassy said, there are some procedures that need looking at. And we found out that actually over the last few years, they have patented devices for dealing with wounds if you get bitten by a bat and things like that. So they clearly have a record here of one or two incidents that they're worried about. They've also cracked down on the practice of selling laboratory animals in the market for food after the experiment is over. They've increased the fines for that in the last year. Now, that may or may not tell us what was happening. It may be they're just being cautious here. But even the best run labs in the world do have lab leaks. You know, there have been lab leaks in Britain, in America, in many other countries. SARS leaked out of a lab at least 6 times, once in Singapore, once in Taiwan, once 4 times in Beijing. It never caused a pandemic when it did so, but it was being studied, it infected people, and in all but one of those cases, we actually don't know how the people got infected. And those were high security labs. So it's almost inevitable, if you work on these kind of viruses in a laboratory, that at some point somebody will pick up an infection, and you've got to have very good procedures for spotting that and preventing it spreading.
To what extent were the Americans financing this lab in Wuhan?
A lot of money was going to Wuhan from America, from the American government, through the aid program, through the Pentagon, and through the National Institutes of Health. It was going via a private foundation called the EcoHealth Alliance, which is a New York-based charity that exists to help labs like this around the world study such viruses with a view to finding the cause of the next pandemic before it happens. So there was a significant quantity of money going from the US to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was one of the biggest partners of the EcoHealth Alliance. But it's a mistake to think that's the main source of money. Most of the money that was being spent on this research in Wuhan was coming from the Chinese Academy of Sciences and other branches of the Chinese government.
Now, I guess we will cut the Chinese some slack for looking at viruses like SARS and try to understand how they might be treated. That's what this kind of laboratory is for. However, there is speculation about whether this virus might be man-made, engineered at this lab. Does your book speculate on whether that has any truth?
We think we can pretty well rule out any possibility that this was a deliberate bioweapon, that they were trying to make a dangerous virus, perhaps for use in military context. There's no evidence of that. It's very unlikely they'd do it in this way or in this place. But what we can't rule out is that one of the experiments they did describe doing on similar viruses, which is to take part of the spike gene out of one virus and put it into another virus, because they can't grow the first virus, but they can grow the second, and they want to be able to test how dangerous it is. That does require a degree of genetic manipulation. It requires swapping in part of one virus into another virus's genes. And they were doing those experiments. Those experiments did sometimes result in much more infectious virus and sometimes much more virulent viruses in mice, but those are mice with human genes. So this virus was getting a sort of training on attacking human beings. Now, we don't know for sure whether this virus was one of those, but rather remarkably, a few months ago, a grant proposal came to light from the EcoHealth Alliance in America, in collaboration with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to say what we want to do is put a special sequence into a SARS-like virus to make it easier to grow in the lab. It's called a furin cleavage site. And this virus is the only SARS-like virus ever seen with a furin cleavage site in it. So it's a bit like finding a program saying we want to put a horn on a horse, and then a unicorn turns up in the same town. It's that unusual.
Matt, isn't this man meddling in nature? Wouldn't we be better off without any of these laboratories?
Well, I don't agree with that, because I think we've done wonderful things with biotechnology. We've made the messenger RNA vaccines for a start. We're doing fantastic things with genetically modifying crops and so on to make them safer to use and that kind of thing. We're making extraordinary medicines. Diabetics and others have their lives saved by insulin that is genetically engineered. So that is, there is fantastic good stuff to come out of biotechnology. But what's frustrating me very much at the moment is to find scientists saying to me, this cannot have come from science, we're not going to look into it, we're not interested in finding it, whereas they should be saying, look, most of science does good, but it's occasionally true that we make mistakes, and we need to be the ones to investigate it to make sure it doesn't happen again.